May 20, 2012, just below 8,516 meters. High on the upper slopes of Lhotse, a single climber stopped moving. The wind was steady, not violent. The sky was thin and pale. There was no avalanche, no scream, no sudden fall. Just a man standing or kneeling where the human body no longer belongs, while oxygen slipped away faster than it could be replaced. His name was Milan Sedla. At that altitude, the brain lies. Muscles weaken without warning. Simple decisions take minutes. The cold does not rush you, it waits. What should have been the final stretch of a lifelong dream had already become a slow, silent collapse. Somewhere nearby, the summit was close enough to feel real, close enough to justify one more step, close enough to make turning around feel impossible. And that is the most dangerous place a climber can be, because Everest and Lhotse do not kill people suddenly. They kill them gradually when strength runs out before judgment does. Milan was not inexperienced. He was not reckless. He had climbed 8,000-meter peaks before. He had turned back before. But on this day, at this height, something subtle shifted. Not panic, not arrogance, just commitment that lasted a little too long. Later, other climbers would pass through this section of the route. Some would know his name, others would not, but all would feel it's the quiet reminder that survival here is never guaranteed, no matter how careful you are. This story isn't about hero worship, and it isn't about blame. It's about one moment, one decision, and how thin the margin really is when the mountain stops negotiating. If you're drawn to stories that slow down disasters, not to sensationalize them, but to understand them, then stay with Ben's stories. Because up here, the climb doesn't end at the summit. Everest and Lhotse don't kill people randomly. They wait. They wait for one small decision to be made at the worst possible moment, when fatigue feels manageable, when the summit feels close, when turning back feels irrational. Most deaths in the death zone are not caused by chaos. They are caused by commitment that lasts just a little too long. In Milan Sedla EK's case, there was no dramatic error to point to, no broken rope, no sudden storm, no ignored warning shouted over a radio. What makes his story unsettling is precisely that the mistake, if it can even be called, that was something almost every experienced climber believes they can manage. Milan believed he could still get back down. To understand why that belief mattered, you have to understand who he was long before Lhotse entered his life. Milan was born on October 1, 1961, and by all accounts, he was drawn to mountains not for conquest, but for clarity. Friends described him as thoughtful, steady, and deeply affected by the quiet order of high places. He didn't climb to escape responsibility. He climbed because the mountains made sense to him in a way the lowlands never quite did. In 2002, Milan reached the summit of Sheshapangma, his first 8,000er. For many climbers, that moment becomes a finish line. For Milan, it became a beginning. The experience didn't inflate his ego, it sharpened his focus. He had learned what it felt like to exist where the body is already failing, and he believed that knowledge mattered. Then came K2. In 2005, and again in 2007, Milan attempted the Savage Mountain. Both times he failed to reach the summit, and both times he turned back alive. These weren't impulsive retreats. They were calculated decisions made under pressure. To outsiders, K2 marked disappointment. To Milan, it reinforced a dangerous but understandable conclusion. Judgment saves lives. That belief followed him to Lhotse. His first attempt in 2010 ended at around 7,800 meters. He was close enough to see the route clearly, close enough to imagine the final push. He didn't collapse. He didn't panic. He turned back because the conditions demanded it, and that restraint became part of his internal math. When Milan returned to Lhotse in 2012, he wasn't chasing redemption, he was chasing completion. He had been there before. He knew the suffering was temporary. He believed the margin was sufficient. This is where the mountain becomes most dangerous, not when a climber is ignorant, but when they are familiar. Familiarity breeds confidence. Confidence breeds commitment. And commitment, at extreme altitude, can quietly erase the option to retreat. Milan did not wake up that morning, planning to die. He woke up believing reasonably that he still had enough left. And on Lhotse, that belief can be fatal. By the time the 2012 expedition settled into its rhythm, Lhotse had already begun its quiet negotiation with the climbers on its slopes. Camps were established higher and higher along the face, each one thinner, colder, and less forgiving than the last. Camp 4 sat in the death zone, where the body no longer repairs itself, and every hour is a withdrawal from a shrinking reserve. Milan was 50 years old, experienced, and aware of exactly where he was. Those around him did not see a man driven by obsession. They saw someone methodical, focused, and unusually calm for that altitude. He checked equipment carefully. He conserved movement. He spoke little but clearly. If anything, he appeared cautious. The night before the summit push, Milan admitted he wasn't feeling well. Not alarmingly so. Not enough to cancel the attempt. At that height, no one feels good. Headaches, weakness, nausea, they are assumed. The danger lies in deciding which discomforts are acceptable and which are not. Weather on Lhotse is rarely dramatic when it turns lethal. There was no violent storm that night. Winds were manageable. The window was narrow but real. Enough to go. Early the next morning, Milan and Radovan Marek left Camp 4 and began the final ascent. Progress was slow, deliberate. Each step was calculated. Oxygen, whether supplemental or physiological, was limited. The mountain offered no landmarks, only slope and sky. Hours passed. Marek reached the summit later that day and began his descent. Milan followed behind, still moving, still communicating. From below, the team waited. Time stretched. Radios crackled intermittently. Milan reported that he was close. Very close. This is where the narrative tightens, not because something dramatic happened, but because almost nothing did. There was no sudden collapse witnessed, no call for help, just a growing delay. At extreme altitude, the brain begins to protect itself by narrowing focus. Long-term consequences fade. The body prioritizes immediate effort. Turning around requires more energy than continuing, at least psychologically. And when the summit is within reach, retreat feels like waste. Somewhere near the top, Milan's margin disappeared. It may have been exhaustion. It may have been the cold seeping deeper than expected. It may have been a moment of indecision that lasted too long. What matters is that, at some point, the balance tipped. The descent, the most dangerous part of any climb, never truly began. From Camp 4, the team waited through the evening. Night arrived, then silence. In the death zone, silence is rarely a mystery. It is an answer. Milan said Lhotse did not fall from Lhotse. He did not fight it. He simply reached the limit of what his body could give. And above 8,000 meters, there is no reserve beyond that. The mountain did not change, but the outcome did. Above 8,000 meters, explanations begin to fail. The rules that apply everywhere else, training, experience, strength, even caution, lose their authority. This region has a name for a reason. The death zone is not dramatic. It is transactional. Every step costs more than it gives back. In the hours after Milan failed to return, the team below faced the same calculation every expedition eventually confronts. Search and rescue at that altitude is not a moral question. It is a physical one. Every climber who goes up risks becoming another problem that cannot be solved. Leopold Sulovskru understood this reality intimately. He had survived Everest by respecting it. Milan's absence was not interpreted as recklessness. It was interpreted as depletion. Milan had been clipped into the fixed lines in the upper section of Lhotse, part of a belay system meant to stabilize movement on steep terrain. To outsiders, that detail can sound reassuring. But fixed ropes do not carry you down. They do not create strength. They only slow a fall if the climber still has the coordination to use them. At extreme altitude, coordination erodes quietly. Hands lose dexterity. Judgment narrows. The body begins prioritizing survival over logic, even when logic would demand retreat. A climber may believe they are resting when they are, in fact, fading. This is where many misunderstand high-altitude deaths. They imagine a single catastrophic error. In reality, most fatalities come from accumulation, energy spent too freely, time underestimated, recovery assumed where none exists. Lhotse is particularly unforgiving because it demands sustained effort at altitude with very little margin for correction. The ascent is steep. The descent is worse. Many experienced climbers consider the way down more dangerous than the push to the top. Once strength is gone, there is nowhere to hide. Some quietly asked whether Milan reached the summit. There is no definitive proof, but in truth, it doesn't matter. At that height, success is not defined by where you stand, but by whether you can still move afterward. Zdeněk Hruber, chairman of the Czech Mountaineering Association, later stated that Milan's exact cause of death could not be confirmed. The mountain erases evidence quickly. Wind moves snow, cold preserves bodies but not answers. The most likely explanation was extreme exhaustion followed by exposure. Milan's remains are still on Lhotse today, not because no one cared but because the location makes recovery nearly impossible without placing others in mortal danger. This is not abandonment, it is acceptance of limits. For climbers who pass that section of the route, Milan is not a shock. He is a marker. A reminder that the mountain does not distinguish between the reckless and the responsible. It only measures what you have left. And when that reaches 0, the negotiation ends. When news of Milan Sedla's death reached the climbing world, the reaction was subdued but heavy. There were no arguments about recklessness, no debates about poor preparation. Instead, there was a quieter discomfort, the kind that settles in when a familiar safety assumption begins to crack. Milan was the kind of climber people point to when defending the idea that experience protects you. He had turned back from K2 twice. He had turned back from Lhotse once. He was known for helping others, not pushing past them. If someone like Milan could run out of margin, then the margin itself was smaller than many wanted to believe. Some climbers focused on age. 50 is not old in mountaineering, but it changes the math. Recovery is slower, cold penetrates deeper, energy drains less predictably. Others rejected that explanation outright, noting that Milan's age also brought patience and discipline. In truth, both arguments missed the larger point. The real danger wasn't age, it was timing. Milan reached the highest part of the mountain late in the day. That detail matters. Above 8,000 meters, time is not neutral. Every extra minute increases exposure. Every delay compounds fatigue. Turning back late feels irrational because so much has already been invested. This is where summit fever becomes misunderstood. Summit fever is not emotional excitement. It is cognitive narrowing. The brain, deprived of oxygen, simplifies the problem. Forward equals progress, backward equals failure. The descent abstract, exhausting, dangerous does not feel real yet. Not until it's too late. Milan likely believed the hardest part was almost over. That belief has ended many climbs. There is also the question of the belay system. Some speculated whether reliance on fixed ropes contributed to a false sense of security. Fixed lines are essential on Lhotse, but they can subtly encourage climbers to push longer than they should. The rope feels like insurance. It is not. Once exhaustion sets in, clipping and unclipping becomes labor. Balance falters. Rest becomes stillness. Stillness becomes final. What makes Milan's story particularly haunting is how quietly it unfolded. No dramatic last transmission, no visible struggle. Just a man who used everything he had to get where he believed he needed to be and discovered too late that nothing remained for the return. In the years since, climbers ascending Lhotse continue to pass his resting place. They do not stop. They cannot, but they notice. And many later admit that it changed their decisions higher up. Milan did not become a symbol by choice. He became one because his story is uncomfortably relatable. He represents the moment when preparation, experience, and intention are no longer enough. And on mountains like Lhotse, that moment arrives without warning. High on Lhotse, the wind still moves the same way it did in May of 2012. Snow still drifts across the route. Climbers still pause at familiar anchors, breathing heavily, counting steps, measuring what little strength remains. The mountain has not changed. Only the names attached to it have. Milan Sedla's is remembered not for a single mistake, but for how narrow the margin truly was. His story resists simple lessons. He was prepared, he was experienced, he had turned back before, and yet, the mountain claimed him anyway. That is the uncomfortable truth. High-altitude climbing eventually forces into view. Success is not guaranteed by good decisions alone. It also depends on timing, weather, physiology, and luck factors no climber fully controls. On Everest and Lhotse, the summit is optional, the descent is not. Milan left behind 2 daughters, a community that respected him, and a quiet presence on a mountain he loved deeply. His body remains where he fell, not as a warning, not as a monument, but as evidence of the limits every climber faces, no matter how capable. For those who continue upward, his story lingers not as fear, but as clarity. A reminder that the most important decision on any mountain is not when to push, but when to stop. If you value stories that explore these moments honestly without glorifying risk or assigning blame, this is why. Bend Stories exists. To slow down the climb, examine the choices, and remember the people behind the headlines. Because in the thin air above the world, the mountain doesn't care why you're there, but the decision to come back will always matter most.